In this unit, we will continue to look at the slave issue, with specific reference to Southern Africa. The slave trade was a universal practice, of which South Africa formed part. We will also look at the various groups who were living on the southern tip of Africa before and until the end of the 18th century. This history is linked closely to the work that you mastered in grade 6. We will also look at the influence of colonization and the expansion of frontiers on the communities in southern Africa. Paste your acidity and listen to the discussion and fill in your answers. Let's mark it when you are done. Before Europeans settled at the Cape, Southern Africa was already home to different groups of people. These groups did not all arrive at the same time, and they had different ways of life. Some hunted and gathered food, some moved with livestock, and others established farming communities. Much later, European farmers settled at the Cape. Think about which group had lived in Southern Africa for the longest time and then consider which groups appeared later. This will help you arrange the San, Khoi, black farmers, and white farmers in the correct order. Historians use dates to help us understand when different groups appeared in Southern Africa. The San had already lived in the region for thousands of years. The Khoi appeared later and became known for keeping cattle and sheep. Black farming communities reached parts of Southern Africa many centuries before European settlement. European settlement at the Cape only began much later. Think about this timeline and match the different groups to the dates given in your worksheet. The San depended on the natural environment for their survival. They hunted wild animals and gathered edible plants, berries, roots, and other foods. They did not grow crops or keep large herds of livestock. Their way of finding food gives us another name that historians often use when describing them. Think about the two main activities they used to obtain food and use these as clues to complete the sentence about the San. The arrival of black farming communities brought important changes to Southern Africa. These communities grew crops and kept animals, but they also had the knowledge and skills needed to work with metals. Iron could be heated and shaped to produce useful objects such as tools and weapons. Historians use this important technological development to name a period in Southern African history. Think about the metal these farmers worked with to complete the sentence. The Khoi depended greatly on their livestock. They kept animals such as cattle and sheep and needed to make sure that their animals had enough grass and water. When grazing became scarce, communities could move with their herds to another area. This way of life meant that they did not always remain permanently in one place. Think about which of the groups on your worksheet were livestock owners who moved from place to place. European sailors had visited the southern African coast before a permanent European settlement was established at the Cape. Eventually, settlers arrived and began establishing a colony. They built homes, cultivated land, and expanded their settlement. People who establish or control a colony are described as colonialists. Look at the groups listed in your activity and decide which group represents these European settlers. The first permanent European colonial settlement at the Cape was established by people working for the Dutch East India Company. The settlers brought their European customs, traditions, and language with them. The language they spoke was therefore connected to the European country from which the settlement was organized. Think about the word Dutch and the country associated with it to work out which language the first colonialists at the Cape spoke. Indigenous groups, people who have been living in a country right from the beginning. Colonization. Settlement in a new country, but still dependent on the motherland. Boundary, an imaginary line that represents a division. Spice trade, the trade in very scarce and expensive spices such as pepper and cloves. The spices came from the east and were difficult to obtain. Refreshment post, a place where fresh provisions such as vegetables, fruit, water, and meat are available. In this unit, we focus on colonization and the expansion of the boundaries of the Dutch settlement and the immediate consequences this had for the Cape. South Africa has a complex history, which includes the Stone Age, Iron Age, and the Renaissance. The San were representative of the Stone Age, since their tools consisted mainly of bone, shells, and rock. The Khoikhoi were the first inhabitants of the Iron Age groups who moved into southern Africa. They were followed by the black farmers 250 years later. By 1652, these groups were still in the Iron Age while Europe and parts of Asia were in the midst of the Renaissance, a period of huge advances in knowledge and technological development. It is important for you to realize this gap in the development of various cultural groups on the southern tip of Africa and that these differences determined the course of South Africa's history. Read below each picture, just to recap on each. Before the settlement of Europeans in the Cape, trade took place along the east coast of Africa. The Arabs traded along the east coast of Africa and the east. The Europeans wanted to trade directly with the east and had to find a sea route to make this possible. The Portuguese were the first Europeans who succeeded in finding a sea route around Africa. The Dutch traders also used the sea route to trade with Indonesia, the so-called Spice Islands. The islands were colonized by the Netherlands and were called Dutch East India. Study the map on the screen that shows the trade routes from Europe. The journey from the Netherlands to the Spice Islands was long, exhausting and dangerous because of the poor conditions at sea. Many sailors died at sea because of a shortage of fresh water, meat, and vegetables. It was important to identify a place along the route where fresh provisions could be uploaded. The Dutch landed in the Cape in 1652 to establish such a refreshment post. For about 150 years, There was close contact between the Cape and the Dutch colonies in the East Indian Islands. The slaves who were sold in the Cape came from the islands and the east and west coast of Africa. Remember to have pasted this worksheet and write down the new words descriptions. Nomadic, moves around. Hunter-gatherer, hunts for meat and gathers plants and fruit from the veldt. Shaman, the spiritual leader and doctor. Herdsman, looks after livestock and moves around in search of grazing. The San. The hunter-gatherers were the first people who lived in southern Africa, long before anyone else. The San lived during the Stone Age. Their tools were manufactured from rock, bone, wood, and shells. The people were nomadic and lived off the land. The men hunted for meat and the women gathered plant material, so they moved around constantly in search of food. Since water was very scarce in the area where the San lived, they squeezed water from the roots of certain plants, dug holes in the sand and buried water in ostrich shells beneath the sand and drank it through a reed straw, long hollow grass stem. The San did not own any cattle or cultivate any crops. Because of their dependency on the plants of the area, they also got to know the medicinal value of certain plants and could treat most common illnesses and typical wounds. The San's weapons consisted of bows, arrows, and long spears. They made the heads of the arrows and spears from rock or bone. The San had a complex religion. They believed in a supreme god called Kagan, who could appear in many different forms. The shaman was the spiritual leader who saw visions by going into a trance. The shaman could be a man or a woman, and was also the doctor. By going into a trance, the shaman could also heal the sick. When the shaman was in a trance, he or she could also illustrate their visions in the form of rock art. Rock art consists of two forms, namely rock paintings and rock engravings. Rock paintings are drawings that were painted on the rock walls, while engravings were carved into the rock. No one can agree on how to interpret rock art, since it is no longer practiced today and the people who did practice it have all died. The colors used in rock paintings were red, yellow, and black. Paste the activity and answer the questions. The Khoikhoi were pastoralist people of southwestern Africa. They had lived in southern Africa since the 5th century AD. They were herdsmen and owned sheep, goats, and cattle. They also hunted for their meat and gathered plant food just like the San. Their cattle were very important to them as they were a symbol of wealth. Just like the San, the Khoikhoi were also nomads and moved around between regions in search of the best grazing for their livestock. The San and Khoikhoi sometimes clashed as they shared the same area for hunting game and gathering plant food. The San stole the Khoikhoi's cattle when game was scarce. The Khoikhoi organized themselves into groups to protect themselves and their cattle. This caused the San to move away to drier areas and the mountains. Over time, the San and Khoikhoi intermarried, which meant that the San later also owned cattle. Pace the activity and answer the questions. Approximately 250 after Christ, African farmers moved into southern Africa. These farmers formed part of the Iron Age, as their tools and weapons were made of iron. The African farmers farmed with cattle and crops. They lived in big groups and, unlike the San and Khoikhoi, they were not nomads. They avoided the drier parts and the Western Cape as they preferred areas with summer rainfall for the cultivation of their crops. The African communities became integrated with the Khorasan, and this is why there are so many click sounds in the Nguni languages. The Khorasan learnt new technology such as the use of iron. From time to time, the Khorasan also worked as the farmers' servants. The African farmer regarded the land as communal property. The chief or king divided the land between the heads of the families, who then divided it further. This meant that land could not be leased or bought. The social structure of the African farmer was as follows. A. Household. This consisted of a wife and children. B. Village. A group of households each controlled by a man. C. Settlement. A number of villages headed by a chief. In addition to cattle, the farmers also planted crops. The crops were the responsibility of the women. They mainly planted millet and sorghum. Cattle were very important and were kept in the center of the village. This is known as the central cattle kraal layout. Cattle were the symbol of wealth and were slaughtered only for important ceremonial events. Cattle could serve as currency for lobola and could be lent to poor people to use the milk. On a technological level, the African farmers mined iron and copper, melted it and manufactured farming implements and weapons. Clay pots were made and used in everyday life for various purposes. Mutual trade took place between the various communities as well as between the San and Khoi. It was in the form of barter trade and in articles that were not freely available in a particular settlement, such as jewelry. On a spiritual level, there were sangomas and herbal doctors. The sangomas were chosen by the ancestors, but also received a spiritual calling, whereafter they underwent extensive training. A sangoma could also be an herbal doctor. An herbal doctor had a good knowledge of plants and their healing powers. The African farmers hunted for their meat requirements, as their cattle were slaughtered only for ceremonial purposes. The hides of the slaughtered animals were used for clothing, blankets, and containers. Only the most important men in the community were allowed to wear the skins of animals such as lions and leopards, as these were regarded as symbols of power. Pace the activity and answer the questions. It is very important to know where the various indigenous peoples lived before the Europeans established a permanent settlement in the Cape. To prevent confusion, current names of people and places are used in the text. The initial idea was never to have a permanent settlement in the Cape. At first, farmers were not allowed to expand their territory and were also not allowed to displace the indigenous people. Over time, however, the European farmers needed more land to make a living. The land in the Cape and surroundings was monopolized by the colonial powers to be sold or allocated to farmers. From the 6th of April, 1652, the first Europeans began to settle in Table Bay in the Cape. Jan van Riebeeck received the instruction from the Lord 17 to establish a refreshment post on the southern tip of Africa. At first, the attempt was not very successful as a result of the climate and the lack of the officials' work ethic. In 1658, the first 9 farms along the Liesbeek River were allocated to free burghers in an effort to increase food production. Under the leadership of Jan van Riebeek's successor, Simon van der Stel, the settlement was expanded to the Eerste River Valley, and the towns of Stellenbosch and Paarl were established. On a visit to the Eerste River Valley, van der Stel promised the farmers as much land as they wanted, and at the end of 1679, some 30 families had already settled there. In 1687, Simon identified 23 couples and allocated farms to them along the Berg River in the well-known Paarl district. By the time van der Stel retired, the settlement had expanded all the way to Tulbagh. Willem Adrian van der Stel succeeded his father, Simon, in 1699 and undertook a journey to the interior. On the other side of Tulbagh, he found a valley, which he called Waveren. He encouraged the colonialists to move there and they became livestock farmers. This was the beginning of the era of the livestock farmer, and by 1771, the settlement had expanded to such an extent that the farms extended all the way to the Fish River. Pace the activity and answer the questions. When done, come to get the work marked. Free burgher. A burgher who was discharged from the permanent employment of the DEIC to follow a career. Independent. Not dependent on or subject to. Slavery. Being a slave, belonging to someone, not free. Islam. Faith of which the Prophet Muhammad was the founder. New World. Southern tip of Africa, New Zealand, Australia, North and South America. Colonization. Establish a settlement. Scurvy. A disease that is the result of a lack of vitamin-rich food. Teeth become loose and gums start swelling and bleeding. Governor. A person who has authority over a colony. Paste the worksheet and fill in the information. The development of navigation by the Portuguese in particular led to longer journeys being undertaken away from land. The Portuguese, encouraged by Prince Henry the Navigator, undertook long journeys in search of prosperity and new continents. This resulted in Vasco da Gama sailing around the southern tip of Africa in 1497. He traded with the Khoi in St. Helena Bay and Mosale Bay. The Portuguese domination on sea diminished over time, and by 1585, the Netherlands started to show an interest in the East, especially as the price of pepper went up again. Following the scouting expedition of Frederick de Houtman in 1597, the need arose for a halfway station. By 1650, the Dutch were the most powerful trading nation in the world. The Verenigde Oost-Indisch Company, VOC, also known as the Dutch East Indian Company, DEIC, traded in pepper, spices, sugar, tobacco, wood, and other manufactured goods from all over the world. The spices from the East and the coffee from Java became increasingly important. There were various reasons for the permanent settlement in the Cape. At first, it was not meant to become a permanent settlement, but merely a place where ships could stop to stock up on fresh supplies, rest and have their ships restored. The Cape was also of strategic importance, since it was halfway between Europe and the East. Apart from this, the Cape was not of much value since it did not provide in the world's immediate need for wood, sugar, rice, tobacco, or wool. To protect their trade interests, the Dutch colonized the countries that were of value to them to obtain a monopoly on trade. However, this plan didn't work out as planned, as the Cape could not provide adequate food for the ships on their way to India. Consequently, many sailors died at sea from scurvy. Initially, no one was interested in exploring the interior, and the Heer 17 concentrated only on making Table Bay, as it was called, economically independent. After 5 years, they decided to establish farms to produce crops that would meet the sailors' need for adequate food supplies. Consequences for the Dutch. With the expansion of the farming activities in the Cape, a need for labor soon arose. The Khorasan were not very willing to work as laborers. The authorities had to apply for the importation of slaves to the Cape. The 90 people who came to the Cape with Van Riebeeck could not cope with all the work. In addition to the vegetables, fruit, and crops that had to be planted, they also had to build a fort to protect the settlement against attacks from the sea and where sick sailors could be treated. Other buildings such as houses also had to be constructed, as not everyone could live in the fort. A kraal had to be built to keep the cattle that they bartered from the Khorasan. The news of the availability of fresh vegetables, fruit, water, and meat spread quickly, and the Cape soon became a popular destination for travelers and merchants. The Cape expanded as a trading station and various businesses developed and expanded. Pace the activity and answer the questions. Why slaves were brought to the Cape? Slaves were brought to the Cape to meet the demand for labor. The local inhabitants, the Khorasan, were not willing to provide the Dutch with labor. There were not enough Dutch people to cope with all the work themselves. In contrast with farms in other parts of the world, the farmers and slaves in the Cape did not concentrate on one crop only. The farms in the Cape were small and the farmers initially tried their hand at mixed farming. Not all the farmers had slaves, as the DEIC tried to control the ownership of slaves. This rule was put in place because there were more slaves than free burghers by 1723. By 1750, about half the farmers still did not own slaves, and about 60% of those who did have slaves only had between 1 and 5 slaves. Only the very wealthy people owned more slaves. From the outset, the Cape was characterized as a slave society. This means that the influence of the free burghers and slaves was found in all aspects of society: the labor market, the economy, the legal system, family, and church. Some slaves also belonged to free black farmers. Where the slaves came from. The slaves who were sent to the Cape mainly came from Madagascar, the East, India and Indonesia, and Africa. The slaves from Bengal or the Coromandel coast were regarded as good seamstresses, and the slaves from Mozambique as having mild temperaments. Some slaves were of mixed descent, a European and a slave. Slaves from Angola, Japan, and Guinea who were highly skilled also found a home in the Cape. How slaves were brought to the Cape. The first slaves reached the Cape on board the Amersfoort, which seized a Portuguese ship. Most slaves were transported to the Cape on board VOC ships. After that, another 288 slaves came to the Cape from Angola on the Hasselt. Slaves were also brought to the Cape on slave ships from Britain, France, and Denmark. A total of 65,000 slaves were imported to the Cape in the time of the VOC. The physical and emotional hardship of the slaves did not promote natural population growth, and the slave numbers had to be supplemented constantly by means of imports. Conversely, the numbers of citizens increased drastically due to a huge increase in the birth rate. What it was like to be a slave in the Cape. House slaves were often regarded as part of the owner's extended family. This is called paternalism. A special effort was made to make in particular the female slaves part of the family. This situation, however, did not imply equality with the family members, and the slaves were acutely aware of this as the children grew up. Young children had the authority to punish slaves. Slaves were always regarded as dependent children in their owners' households. The slaves in service of the company performed various tasks and lived in the slave quarters. The tasks included working in the vegetable garden and hospital, building the harbor, building roads, chopping wood, and handling construction work. The special police force, which consisted of men of pure Asiatic descent, maintained law and order in the streets and community. The slave quarters were actually a fort across from the hospital. The building had no windows and both men and women lived there. The hygienic conditions were appalling, and there was a very high mortality rate among the slaves. The slaves in private ownership were often trained as tradesmen, of which the most important trades included bricklayers, blacksmiths, and carpenters. On the farms, the slaves gained experience in cultivating vineyards, wheat, rye, and barley. Slaves worked mainly on the free burghers' farms and in the Huguenots' vineyards. Slaves could also be rented out as labor tenants. The money they earned was an extra income for their owners. Extra tasks such as fishing and selling products on markets were other ways in which owners applied slave labor to their advantage. Slaves who were christened as Christians had the same rights as Christians and could not be sold to non-Christian owners. However, the owners were not really too concerned about christening slave children. Owners did not want to lower a slave's market value and preferred not to christen them. Pace the activity and answer the questions in your books. Causes and effects of slave resistance in the Cape. The awful conditions and the heavy punishment meted out to slaves gave rise to resistance among slaves. Some slaves could move around freely, but had to carry a signed pass that served as permission from their owners. The cruel punishment meted out to the slaves included torture, beatings, long hours' work and starvation. The wheel was used to break a slave's bones and some slaves were burnt alive. Slaves who ran away and were caught were put in chains. Slaves were not allowed to ride on wagons or horseback, and they were also not allowed to talk to other slaves in the street. During church services, they were also not allowed to gather outside the entrance to the church building. The punishments and treatment made the slaves resentful. They showed their unhappiness in a number of ways. Attacking their owners. Stealing from their owners. Working very slowly. Running away. Breaking equipment and implements on purpose. Burning down homesteads and crops. Being openly defiant towards owners. There were two slave revolts in the early 1800s. The first was in 1808, in which two brothers, Abraham and Louis, and two Irish sailors, James Hooper and Michael Kelly, were involved. They incited 300 slaves to march to the Cape, overthrow the government and replace it with a new government that would support the abolition of slavery. However, the revolt was quickly suppressed and most of the slaves were sent back to their owners. The four instigators were executed. In 1825, Gallant van der Cape and a number of slaves brutally murdered their owner and his family. Gallant and many of the slaves who took part in the revolt were sentenced to death. Paste the activity and answer the questions in your book. Slave legacy in the Cape, including Islam and the development of the Afrikaans language. The emancipation of the slaves took place in 3 stages. In 1806, the slave trade was banned, followed by mitigation steps to ease the plight of slaves, 1816 to 1833, and the eventual abolition of slavery in South Africa, 1833. By that time, the most powerful country in the world, Britain, had colonized the Cape and was the driving force behind the worldwide abolition of slavery. After the ban on the slave trade came into effect in 1808, slave prices rose dramatically and almost quadrupled. In 1822, William Burchell noticed that people of mainly Dutch, German, and French descent regarded themselves as Afrikaners and were speaking a very poor version of Dutch. The Netherlands could not enforce the official language, since schools were not well attended and offered only elementary education. Dutch was also simplified so that the slaves of various descents and the Khoikhoi could also speak and understand it. This language would come to be known as Afrikaans and contains elements of Malay Portuguese, such as Bay Danki that comes from the Malay Banjar. Other words such as Keri, Bori, and Pisang were also of Malay origin. Arabic, Nguni, and Khorasan also influenced the development of Afrikaans. As far as religion is concerned, most slaves converted to Islam. The Christian Church played almost no role in the emancipation of the slaves. The word Christian was associated with status as well as political and social issues. Owners could decide whether or not they wanted their slaves christened, and christened slaves would have the same rights as other Christians, which also meant that they could not be sold to non-Christians. Some owners chose to not have their infant slaves christened because it would benefit them financially. This contributed to the slow conversion of slaves to Christianity. Education was not very popular among the Dutch, who were more concerned with working on the farms, and by 1809, there were only 515 learners in Dutch schools, compared to the 162 learners in slave schools. In Islam, teaching and education were interlinked. In 1800, the Muslims received permission from the British government to build a madrasa, where mostly black and brown learners were taught. By 1850, there were 2 big schools in Cape Town where children were taught Afrikaans and Arabic. In 1856, the first Afrikaans book was printed in Arabic lettering. Free black people also used their wealth to emancipate slaves, including Christian slaves. Slaves could also fill leadership positions in the Muslim community. This made Islam very attractive to the slaves. Slaves' knowledge of vineyards and winemaking made a significant contribution to the economy of the region. These included related skills such as fruit farming and making vats, barrels, cabinets and shoes. The slaves seldom retained their own surnames and received new names from their owners. Sometimes the names were those of the owners, or Bible names, indigenous names, classic names, or nicknames. Malay food and music still play an important role in South African culture today. The Cape Coons, which is a big annual competition in the Cape, still has a Malay flavor. Malay food such as bobo thai, curry, chutney, stews and samosas are still part of the traditional Afrikaans cooking. Paste the activity and answer the questions. Slave society. A community reflecting the lives of slaves in every aspect, including the economy, labor, and family life. French Huguenots. People originating in France. Fugitives because of their Protestant faith. Assimilation. Incorporation of one group into another. Trek farmers. farmers moving around searching for new grazing and farm. Dispossession of land. Dispossessed for compensation. Genealogy. Family tree research. The Dutch who came to the Cape with Jan van Riebeeck worked for the VOC. They became sailors or soldiers or VOC officials out of necessity and signed 5-year contracts with the VOC. They found themselves at the bottom of the hierarchy of the VOC, and most were only semi-literate. With the arrival of the first slave ship, the Amersfoort, the second kind of citizen moved into the Cape, the unfree burgher. These two groups would determine the character of the settlement. The enormous growth in slave numbers against the slow growth of the citizens meant that it became a slave society. A slave society means that all aspects of the settlement reflected the lives of slaves. The relationship between master and slave was the foundation of all other relationships: economic, legal, family and church. Jan van Riebeeck found the officials to be unwilling to farm or perform manual labor. The fresh produce that was sold mainly to the company fetched very low prices and could only be sold to ships anchored in the harbour after 3 days. In 1657, Van Riebeeck discharged the 9 burghers from service to the company to allow them to farm on lots of approximately 11 4 each, located east of Table Mountain. By 1661, Van Riebeeck was forced to acknowledge that the farmers could not survive with the prices that the VOC paid them for their products. Van Riebeeck knew that the farmers would only achieve success if they farmed for themselves. Some of the farmers closer to Table Bay could also generate an income from trades such as carpenters, bricklayers, blacksmiths, and by running pubs or hostels. By 1690, there were about 788 free burghers and 381 slaves in the Cape. The Huguenots. In 1688, another group of people arrived in the Cape, namely the Huguenots. These people were of French origin and fled from France because they were persecuted for being of the Protestant faith. Simon van der Stel settled the Huguenots among the Dutch farmers to ensure that they integrate with them. By 1750, the assimilation was almost complete. The Huguenots were, however, allowed to establish their own congregations. They also had a stabilizing effect on the population numbers of the burghers in the Cape. Well-known Afrikaans surnames that are of Huguenot origin include De Vries, Du Plessis, Theron, Terreblanche, Marais and Leroux. The Huguenots were very religious. Their knowledge of vineyards and wine was invaluable to the economy of the Cape. The simple instruction to Jan van Riebeeck to start a fruit orchard and a vegetable garden, build a fort and a hospital and exchange livestock from the indigenous people over time developed into an extensive community and the eventual colonization of the Cape and surroundings. The initial instruction to establish a refreshment post or halfway station for ships traveling from Europe to the east resulted in the establishment of a complex society on the southern tip of Africa. Pace the activity and answer the questions. The inland movement of trek farmers with their slaves and servants. The farming community in the Cape could be divided into 3 groups: those who lived in the Cape, the wine and wheat farmers in the Western Cape region, and the frontier livestock farmers across the First Mountain ranges. Almost all the inland farmers were cattle farmers. The cattle farmers moved away from the Cape region in search of better and more grazing. They owned big herds of lots of grazing. Most of them were subsistence farmers, but they were all dependent on the market for an income. In most cases, farms could not be bought or leased. In 1798, the government determined that the boundaries of the Cape Colony extended to the Buffalo River in the west, the Nieuweveld Mountains in the northeast, and from there along the Taka, Bavians and Fish rivers down to the sea. However, the trek farmers clashed with various inland Khoikhoi groups. The Khoikhoi were not unified and each group individually clashed with the trek farmers. This weakened the Khoikhoi's resistance, while diseases such as smallpox that sometimes wiped out entire tribes and mange among their cattle further weakened them economically. Apart from the European trek farmers, they also had to deal with the coarser farmers. After 1770, some of the Khoikhoi chose to work as labourers for trek farmers, rather than the Khosars. Some Khoikhoi worked for the farmers because of their knowledge of the environment and taking care of cattle in dry areas. In the process, they surrendered their land and cattle to the frontier farmers. Lifestyle and stories of the trek farmers. The trek farmers had to adapt to their changing circumstances. They did not have the luxury of a house, and their ox wagons became their homes. They had to live simply. The trek farmer's most important possessions were his weapon, horse, cattle, and Bible. They did not have a lot of money as they depended on the veldt for their survival. Their food consisted of game, beef, and mutton. Goods such as coffee and sugar were scarce, and they seldom ate bread as they never lived in one place long enough to plant wheat. Apart from their horses, the ox wagon was their primary means of transport. There weren't any roads, and so sometimes they first had to build roads before they could move further. Since the ox wagon also served as their house, they could not take along too much furniture. When a family stayed in one place for some time, the farmer would build a wattle and daub house and make basic furniture such as tables, chairs, beds, and chests. Tin plates and mugs were part of the cutlery. The wattle and daub houses had between 1 and 3 rooms. The trek farmers were self-sufficient and made their clothes, karosses, and shoes from animal hides. They made their own candles and soap. For other essential goods such as guns, ammunition, material, coffee, and sugar, they visited the nearest town from time to time and obtained these goods through barter trade. They also made their own medicine based on the knowledge that they acquired from indigenous inhabitants. Medicines were made from herbs. Pace the activity and answer the questions. Land dispossession and consequences for the indigenous population. As the trek farmers moved further and further away from the Cape, they clashed with various indigenous groups about land and grazing. The first indigenous people who lost land and hunting fields were the San. Their first threat was the Khoikhoi and later the Xhosa. The Khoikhoi and the San competed for the same hunting fields. The Khoikhoi was a stronger group with more sophisticated weapons. The San were nomadic hunters and integrated with the Khoikhoi over time. The Khoikhoi spread along the southern tip of Africa and clashed with the Khosars, who were gradually moving south. The Xhosa farmers competed with the Khoikhoi for grazing for their cattle. The Khosars were organized into large groups and could easily drive the Khoikhoi, who were not united, from the sought-after areas. By the time the European trek farmers arrived at the Sneeberg Mountains in 1770, the San were no longer well organized. However, the farmers were still met with heavy resistance from the San, who fought to retain their hunting fields. The farmers did not receive any support from the government in the Cape and had to defend themselves. This is where the commando system had its origin. The expansion of the trek farmers' land later resulted in the detribalization of the Khoikhoi. In addition, the massive smallpox epidemics of 1713, 1755, and 1767 almost wiped out the entire population. Since most of them were homeless, some joined the farmers on the farms as laborers, while others continued to live as nomads or started working for the company. A group of Khoikhoi captains moved inland to try and retain their identity, including the Karana, Namakwa, and Griqua, who settled along the Orange River. At the Great Fish River, the European farmers came across the Xhosa farmers. Over a period of 100 years, 9 frontier wars were fought between the two groups. They mainly competed for grazing and hunting fields. The frontier between the two groups changed constantly and is known as the shifting frontier. After the last frontier war in 1878, Griqualand East was also incorporated into the Cape Colony, and the Transkei was gradually incorporated into the colony until Pondoland was added in 1894. The Khosars were defeated, and the British government gave the land on which the Xhosa had farmed for generations to the European trek farmers. Genadendal, the first mission station in southern Africa, 1738. Between 1737 and 1744, the missionary George Schmidt worked among a small Khorasan group in the Bavians Kloof. He only christened 5 people. This caused a rift between him and the Reformed Church, and he returned to Europe shortly afterwards. In 1792, 3 Moravian missionaries returned to South Africa and found that one of the women Schmidt had christened, Magdalene, had retained the Christian faith. They built a mission station, Genadendal, in Bavians Kloof. The German missionaries were in favor of a strongly disciplined and industrious community. The broader community was in favor of this attitude. The Khoikhoi were saved from certain demise. The community became self-sufficient and practiced a number of trades, for example making knives. The mission station also became an educational center. The first college of education was established in 1838. The work of William Bleek and Lucy Lloyd. William Bleek, who came from Berlin, became interested in African languages in 1851 and in particular to prove the relationship between the languages of North Africa and the Khoikhoi. In 1853, he met John William Colenso, who invited him to Natal to record Zulu grammar. In 1856, after completing the project, he travelled to Cape Town on the invitation of Governor George Grey, where he worked as a translator. In 1861, he met Jemima Lloyd in Cape Town and they got married in 1862. Lucy, Jemima's sister, moved in with them. During 1863, William Bleek made contact with the first Zam speakers. Later, he also made contact with prisoners in Breakwater near Calvinia. Adam Kleinhard provided William with the necessary information to compile a Zam glossary and short sentences. By 1870, Bleek and Lucy Lloyd were working closely together to record the folk tales, language, customs, history, and religion of the Zam. Bleek and Lloyd made an enormous contribution to the anthropological and ethnographic knowledge of the Khoikhoi. They recorded the genealogy, place of origin, and course of their daily lives. They also took photos of the subjects and drawings. Between 1875 and 1876, Bleek sent reports to the Secretary of Native Affairs to apply for funding and to make the British government aware of the need to preserve the Khoi traditions and heritage. Paste the activity and answer the questions. With this activity, try and remember as much information on your own. The easier you can answer means you understand your work.